Hey everyone, I'm Coach Chippys and I've been a professional top laner or head coach for the past 8 years. During this time I've reached Worlds and MSI multiple times. Now I'm a full-time coach with a ton of passion towards helping players unlock their potential and climb to their dream rank. How's it going everyone? Today we're going to be covering the item builds for Season 14. However, keep in mind in this video, I'm only going to be updating the builds for the champion guides that I've made in the past, because although the information in those guides is still good, the builds are of course outdated, so I wanted to make a bit of an update to let you guys know the best build for those champions, so you continue your journey of mastering them. So if that sounds good to you, feel free to skip ahead to whatever champion you want to see, I will timestamp it down below, and we'll get started. To kick things off, we have Jax, the first champion I ever made a guide for, and with the removal of Sundra, his build is quite different. There are some things you need to know about, but we will go through it one at a time, and we'll start off with these starting items. It's either going to be Doran's Blade or Doran's Shield, so you will be going Doran's Shield in matchups where they have a lot of poke. So champions such as Vladimir, champs like GP, of course Doran's Shield regen will give you a ton of value, and you're going to be going Doran's Blade in a lot of matchups where you want to be all-ending them. So matchups such as Riven, you're going to be fighting them to the death. She doesn't really have a lot of poke, so you really need to have a lot of combat stats when all-ins like that. Even a champion like Camille, you need their combat power from Doran's Blade. You can go shield in matchups where you're quite unsure. So for example, Fiora, she can poke you down with Q, especially if she runs Grasp, so Doran's Shield can be quite valuable. But in general, I would say in elo brackets below Diamond, Doran's Blade is going to give you more value most of the time. Now, as for your first buy, you may notice Triforce is the main item you're going to be rushing. The problem with that item is the build path is quite terrible. Sheen costs 1k gold, half-bound X is horrible, so you're going to be building components most of the time. So you're going to be looking to go either double longsword refillable or longsword ruby refillable, depending on how much gold you have when you base. And that is going to be, you're basically going to be building components, unless you can get a Sheen in one go. Of course, that's going to be great. If you base and you have Doran's Blade Sheen refillable, that is a great buy. It's just very hard to get that much gold. So most of the time, you will be building components. So I recommend not just building a half-bound Axe or something like that, or a full Phage, because you still want to get Sheen early on. But if you base with not enough gold for it, just get a couple longswords, ruby, until you can get enough Sheen on your next recall. Now, the alternative you can have is rushing tier 2 boots, but only Mercury treads in my opinion, because the way you play out certain matchups, and namely Kennen and Gragas, Merc treads will really help you win those lanes. Because the way they stop you from trading onto them is of course CCing you, Gragas E and Kennen stun, Merc treads is going to give you a ton of value in that lane, so even if you can't get 1100 on your first recall, I recommend just going null magic in tier 1s, and eventually on your second recall you will get the Merc treads. Really important in those matchups, but if you're not playing versus a AP crowd control champion, most of the time you're just going to opt into a couple swords or a ruby or even a sheen if you can afford it. Now, as for your first item, most of the time you are going to go Trinity Force. That is going to be your staple item in the majority of your Jax games, but there is a build where you can run Grasp of the Undying in certain matchups and rush Sundered Sky instead. Now, I don't recommend this most of the time, I only recommend it in matchups where you absolutely need the Grasp. So, for example, if you're versus a Kennen, and you've had a lot of problems in that matchup, maybe you're versus some good Kennens depending on your elo bracket, Grasp and Sundered Sky Rush can be quite good, because you don't really want to be going Grasp with Trinity Force. It doesn't feel that good on Jax especially, so having Sundered Sky first and then building more tanky items such as Titanic Hydra or even, Frozen Heart, items like that, so you're a bit of more of a team fighter than a side laner versus AP champs, and the Grasp and Sundered Sky Rush are going to help you in the lane a lot. However, most of the time, I would not worry too much about that, and you'll just run lethal tempo with Triforce. The only exception is if you're versing some really hard range matchups where you feel like you definitely need the Grasp. The second item you're going to be buying is going to, of course, depend on the matchup and the game state, where the main two choices you're going to have are going to be between Titanic Hydra and Sundered Sky. Now, you're going to go Sundered Sky in matchups where you're going to be fighting someone in the side lane quite often. So, for example, if you're versus a Fiora or a Camille, Sundered Sky is going to give you a ton of value in that 1v1. But if you're just up against an Ornn or a Cassante or something like that, feel free to go Titanic Hydra, one-shot the wave, eat jungle camps, and have a bit more beef in team fights. Feels a lot stronger, and especially as a 2-item spike, because you're not going to be very squishy, where you would be if you rush Sundered Sky second. But of course, having really high side lane power is a key part of Jax's identity, so you want to be going Sundered Sky in matchups where you need it. Now, there are alternatives, of course. You can go Frozen Heart in games where the item is going to give you a ton of values, because the item is so cheap, it is such a great pickup. So, for example, let's say you're up against a Graves jungle and a Quinn top. Frozen Heart second is going to be amazing. That is going to be a game-changing item, and getting it second is going to be fine. Where in the past, you probably would get it on third on Jax, I would say, most of the time. But because it's so cheap in this meta, it's really easy for you to pick it up, especially in games where they have a lot of auto attackers. Now, as for Wit's End, that is going to be in matchups where you're versing AP threats in side lane. So, for example, if you're up against a Gwen, you're probably going to need to pick up a Wit's End, especially if they have some CC in their comp. from other places. You don't always have to. If you stomp the Gwen in lane and you're going to beat them in side lane regardless, you can just go Sundered Sky. Especially if they have an AP jungle, AP top, Wits End will still give you a ton of value, especially in games where you're going to be fighting AP champions in the side lane. And as for boots, they're pretty straightforward. You're going to be going Mercury Treads in games where they have a lot of crowd control or very heavy magic damage. Especially if they have an AP top jungle, Merc Treads are going to be huge. Plated Steel Caps is going to be the reverse. If they have a ton of physical damage in their comp, you can pick this up. But if they don't have that much physical damage, or you base with enough gold for it, cooldown boots are actually a really big pickup on Jax, because they're so cheap, and CDR is really good on him. Of course, you get more ease off, more Qs, really key kit parts of his kit. So feel free to go CD boots if you can in a lot of situations, but there are just some games where you need tabbies, and the games where you need Merc Treads, you should never miss out on them. Now, as for Swiftness boots, pretty rare that you'd pick this up. I mainly pick this up in matchups such as Nasus or Olaf, where the slow resist is quite big, but most of the time you're going to be going the other three. Moving on to third items, and I'm not going to touch on the items that I talked about just before, so we'll start with Spirit Shojin. Now, this is a great item, basically in games where you don't need anything else. I feel like you don't really need the Frozen Heart if they're not that auto-attack base, not that heavy AD, or they don't have a bunch of magic damage threats and you don't need an MR item. Spirit Shojin is quite good. Or in games where you're just winning through side lane. We feel like there's no way we can win a team fight, I just want to be as strong as possible in my 1v1. Spirit Shojin is a great pickup because you're not going to be building Hullbreaker anymore. That item is quite bad, so you just want to be building items that give you a lot of power in the 1v1. In games where you're going to be playing side lane. Now, Spirit Shojin is pretty good in team fights as well, don't get me wrong, but it's not going to be as good as some alternatives, where if they had a bunch of auto-attacking champions, a bunch of physical damage, Frozen Heart, great pickup of course. Same for the reverse, if they have a bunch of magic damage threats, the Koenig Rukun can be quite good. Now, the difference between when you go Koenig and Wits End is going to be in games where you're side laning versus AP champs. So you need all the combat power and a bit of MR, so if you're versus Gwen, for example, like we talked about before, or the Vladimir's playing side, Wits End can be quite beneficial, but if you're just mainly team fighting, if it's one of those games where there's a bunch of action, you're not really going to be able to win through side, maybe you lost your lane, or maybe the guy you're playing up against can hold you quite easily, Koenig Rukun can be quite good, especially versus artillery mages. If they have champions like Zoe or Syndra, champions like Xerath, that's going to be a great pickup to block a lot of that incoming damage and poke, so that you're not chunked out before the fight even begins. Now, Zhonya's is pretty rare as a third item. I like it better as a 4/4 fifth, but it's still a good pickup. On Jax, it was better last season. Of course, you could get an early stopwatch, but now it's still fine because the active is just so impactful in Jax. You can buy so much time getting to the middle of the enemy team with a stun, and then pop Zhonya's, come back out. Your stun's going to be back off cooldown in later fights. So you can be building Zhonya's in games where you're mainly team fighting, of course, and they have a lot of bursts. So if you want to be blocking key abilities, maybe their Karthus is fed, you could block that. Maybe they have a strong Zed or a Talon. Or basically, they just have a lot of key disengage tools that they're going to be popping onto you. You engage, maybe they have a Zyra card, something like that. Zhonya's is going to be a huge pickup. Now, to round off our build, we have a couple new options. You can go Sterix Gauge, and this item feels quite good in games where you went the Sundered Sky second, Triforce first, and you went Frozen Heart in your build. Because although that gives you a bunch of armor, it doesn't really give a lot of HP, so Sterix Gauge feels quite good, and also Juxtro the Protein. Now this is a really overpowered item right now, I'd say in general, but you wouldn't get it early on Jax, of course. It'd be mainly as a last item, maybe fourth, in games where you already had Frozen Heart, Koenig Rukun, where the bonus resistances, of course, from this item, going to be very valuable. So generally, you're going to build this really late into the game when you're mainly focusing on team fighting, and you already have some resist built up. And down below I do have some full build examples, but you don't have to copy this item by item. You can if you're just starting out, but of course a lot of these items are situational. You wouldn't go Zhonya's every game, of course. A lot of games you would go Juxtro the Protein, so that wouldn't always be your last item. These are just some examples of what some builds will look like once you reach that 5th, 6th item point in the game. Next up, we have Renekton, and as for your starting item, it's either going to be Doran's Blade or Doran's Shield. Doran's Blade in matchups where you're going to be looking to all in. So champions such as Camille, champs like Riven, Doran's Blade will give you a bunch of value, but you're going to be going Doran's Shield in matchups where they can poke you down. So champions like Kennen or GP are quite obvious ones for Shield, but on Renekton, if you're ever unsure which one to go, I would say default to Shield, because this is a champion where you don't want to be losing lane early getting poked down, because your level 3 is a lot stronger than your level 1 on this champion, compared to Jax, who has a really strong level 1. So in a lot of matchups, if you're uncertain which one to go, I would say default to Shield, and as you get more comfortable, start experimenting with Blade, but of course, Shield is always going to be good in matchups where you need the regen, where they're going to be hitting you constantly, and Doran's Blade's always going to be good in matchups where you're going to be all-inning them, and looking for very extended trades. Now, as for your first buy, you probably noticed already that your first item is going to be Titanic Hydra most of the time. However, the way you build into that item is quite important, because you don't just want to be rushing Tiamat every single time, even though the auto attack animation cancel with the active can feel quite good. The problem with Tiamat Rush is you're going to be locked into pushing, which you might want to do. You might want to constantly push, play for grubs, play the proxy, proc demolish on their tower, but it really depends on your matchup and game state. Because if you're up against an Ornn or a Scion, for example, maybe a Cho'Gath, of course going Tiamat early can be great, because you're going to push them under tower, and you're going to have a lot of free time to move, to proxy, attack the enemy jungler, and take over the game in that way, because it's not as valuable to play for a freeze and kill on a Scion or a champion like that, because there's still going to be a useful tank later on in the game. So in a situation where you're up against a champion that you want to be punishing early and getting a big lead over, you're going to be wanting to get Tunneler early, and then build Tiamat last, I'd say, before Titanic Hydra, because Tunneler is pretty good in early pickups, not amazing, but of course the stats it gives you is also not going to break the wave, so it's really easy for you to play for freeze, play for punish, play for gank setup, and get an early advantage over the enemy top laner, which is what you want to do on this champion most of the time. Now, there are alternatives, of course. You can go Merc Treads in games where you verse champions like Gragas or Kennen, lots of AP and crowd control, or you can go Hex Drinker Rush into a champion like Rumble, where his job is also the same as you. He wants to get ahead of you early, you want to get ahead of him, so building an item like Hex Drinker just for that 1v1 power can be quite useful. Now, as for your first item, you're going to be going Titanic Hydra most of the time. It's going to be your most standard build on Renekton, because Titanic Hydra gives you a really strong one-item spike, especially in early skirmishing and teamfighting situations. Makes you quite beefy, the auto reset feels quite nice, so a really good pickup on Renekton, also really good at just pushing side and grouping up, because Renekton you want to be fighting a lot early game, getting a lot of work done before you get outscaled, so this is a great item, so that you basically remove side lane, one-shot it and group up, or you can farm camps, have a lot of options with it, so it's a really good standard item I'd say, but you can go Sundered Sky in games where you're going to have to fight someone on the side. They have a Fiora or a Gwen champion like that that's going to be fighting you and trying to pull you away from these fights, so Sundered Sky, having some 1v1 dueling power can be quite nice. Now, as for Eclipse, this is going to be in matchups where, for example, if you're up against a ranged champion, it can feel quite good. Champion like Gnar or Kennen, this could be a good early pickup. A lot of stats, the shield feels quite good in trades. However, you are going to be weaker in teamfights, keep that in mind. So it's a trade-off for you having a lot of power and trying to get ahead early game over these ranged champs. And you can also build it versus a champion like Rumble, but maybe you don't want to commit to a full Hex Drinker or a more, something like that. Maybe Rumble is their only AP threat. Then, of course, the Eclipse, with maybe a Merc Treads as a little bit of MR, can feel quite nice. And the more is like we just talked about, you're going to be upgrading the Hex Drinker when you're up against Rumble, but I only recommend doing this in games where they have multiple AP threats, not just the Rumble for the 1v1. Now, as for your second item, you can go Titanic Hydra in games where you rush the Sundered Sky, or vice versa, Sundered when you rush Titanic, and that's going to be a really powerful standard 2-item spike for you. You're going to feel quite strong, and it feels quite good to hit that 2-item spike because you have a good combination of 1v1 power and teamfight power. So once you get to those 2 items, you do feel quite strong. That's where you're going to be doing your best work. But you do have some alternatives in games where you're up against a really tanky team comp or a tank in side lane. So versus Cassante, great example, really tanky champion that can also play side lane. He can do it all. You can go Black Cleaver as your second item, and this feels quite good paired with the Titanic Hydra because you don't have any ability haste from the Hydra. So this will really make up for that. And you can also go the Maw as a second item and really heavy AP damage comps. And as for your boots, you're going to be going Merc Treads in games where they have a bunch of crowd control or heavy magic damage. You're going to be going Plated Steel Caps when they have a bunch of AD threats, especially if you're facing one in the side lane. So if you're up against a Jax or a Fiora, Plated Steel Caps are going to be a great pickup for you, even if they have magic damage elsewhere. Unless you desperately need the crowd control reduction from Merc Treads, then of course you can just tough it up a bit and go Merc Treads. And you can go Swiftness boots into Nasus or Olaf, or champions with a lot of slowing abilities, or even, Singe with Rylai's Rush, champs like that. It can feel pretty good. Or you can go the Ionian boots of Lucidity in games where you don't really need the other 3, and it's just a nice cheap pickup when you base for around 600 gold. Now, as for your third item, I'm not going to talk about the items we already talked about, so we'll start with Spear of Shojin. Now, this is a great pickup in games where you need a bit more extra damage, where you're the main carry threat or you need more power in the side lane. This is a good pickup because you lose a lot of ability haste this season from not having Gore Drinker, because you have Titanic Hydra, which gives none, even though you do get a little bit from Sundered Sky. Spear of Shojin is a really good pickup to make up for that missing haste, especially in games where you need a bit more carry potential or a bit more power in side lane. Now, you can go Sterix Gauge in games where you don't really need that, maybe you need to be a bit more of a frontline for your team, and there's no resistance that's really calling out to you. You don't really need armor or MR that badly, they're a pretty well balanced comp. Or you do want to have a bit of damage and a bit more beef. It really just depends on the game, but Sterix is more of a filler item for when you don't really need anything else. And Randuin's is an item that you buy very specifically, so if they're multiple crit chance champions or a one one champ comp. So if they have a Tristana mid, let's say Ashe AD carry, you can build a Rangers or Yasuo or Yone in there somewhere. Yone top could be a really good pickup, or just in games where everyone on the team is either supporting them or just doing quite poorly, and they have maybe a 10-0 Tristana AD carry. He's carrying the game. Of course, you can pick up Rangers in that situation. Now, Thornmail is going to be in games where you need the healing cup. I don't really like to go the AD healing cut item. I feel like it's quite weak, the Kimpunk. So Thornmail is going to be a great pickup in games where you need it. So if you're up against a Fiora in the side lane, maybe their healing's getting out of control, or they have champs like Soraka, you can look to get up pick up a Thornmail, and it's going to feel quite good because you get a lot of HP from the Titanic Hydra. So having a big resistance item as your third item feels quite nice, which is why you also have the option to go Kaenic, Rukun, or Force of Nature. Now, Kaenic in games where they're looking to outrange you, poke you down, where they have control mages, this is going to be a great pickup. And Force of Nature when they more so have consistent damage, magic damage threats, such as Cassiopeia. And rounding off the build, the only item we didn't touch on, Juxo the Protein, this is a really good final item, especially if you already have an MR and an armor item in your build. So if you have a Rangers of Thornmail and let's say a Kaenic Rukun, this is going to be a really good pickup for you as one of your last two items. Going to make you quite beefy, quite tanky, and really strong in team fights later on points of the game, where Renekton gets outscaled at late game, of course, but having this item with a bunch of tank items, of course, you're going to be a beefy frontline for your team, and you're still going to do damage, especially if you have the Titanic Hydra and Sundered Sky, really good 2-item spike, but later on to the point you're mainly just trying to get a bit beefier so that you can get multiple stuns down in a fight, be a frontline for your team. Because you don't scale much, you're not going to win through side lane, on Renekton most of the time. You're mainly going to win if you're a team fighting, so having the strong team fight item is going to help you with that. And I have a couple examples of full builds down below. You don't have to copy them item for item, but this is generally what a Renekton build would look like, especially the first 3 items. Next up, we have Aatrox, and as for your starting item, you're either going to be going Doran's Blade or Doran's Shield, but I do recommend defaulting to Shield most of the time. Aatrox is really weak levels 1 through 3, so it's going to be really hard for you to significantly beat your opponent down with Doran's Blade, utilize that bonus AD. Most of the time you just want to be regenning, staying high HP, getting last hits if you can, poking them down, and then once you're around level 4 to 5, that's when you can start to fight back. But if you've already taken a bunch of damage before that point and you don't have Doran's Shield, it can be really hard to do so. But if you have really high mastery on the champion, or you feel really confident in some matchups, say for example you're against a Cho'Gath or a Scion, something that's quite easy, you can go Doran's Blade, of course, and get away with it. But if you're ever in a matchup that's more a heavy trading matchup, such as Renekton, and you're really unconfident, or you're still learning the champion, most of the time you will just go Doran's Shield, and then look to mess around with Blade later on as you build mastery. Moving on to your first buy, and if you can get plated seal caps on your first recall in one go, it's going to feel quite good. I don't recommend building components of it, going cloth armor boots, anything like that, but if you can get the whole item in one go versus champions like Jax or Riven, it's going to feel amazing for you. These high auto-attacking based champions, champs like Jayce as well, it can feel quite good, but if not, feel free just to go multiple longswords, it's going to feel fine as well. Or even a tunneler in certain matchups where you might need that defensive stat. But most of the time, you're not going to be going tunneler, you're going to be going Merc Treads, Tabbies, or just multiple longswords, especially if you don't have enough gold for them. The only reason I really have tunneler there is it is an option to rush tunneler early instead of tier 2 boots, where you want to be getting your Sundered Sky as fast as possible. If you can get that one item spike before your opponent in matchups where they're looking to build a similar item or Triforce, a big spike of their own, then of course you're going to be stronger than them on that timer. It really depends how you want to be playing it out, but Ninja Tabby most of the time is going to be the safer choice. And as for your first item, we just touched on it, but Sundered Sky is really powerful in Aatrox, the extra healing, and in teamfights you'll probably find yourself stabbing multiple people one at a time, and just getting insane amounts of value from this item. Feels really strong in side lane as well. It's a really good pickup on this champion, but you can go Eclipse in matchups where you do need a bit more side lane power. So specifically versus Jax, quite hard to land an auto attack on that guy, so this item's going to feel quite good, but you can also get it versus other champions like Camille or Fiora, where you want to be having a bit more 1v1 power and punishing them early game and shutting them down in the side lane. Now as for your second item, you're going to be going Spirit of Trojan most of the time. This item combined with Sundered Sky is an amazing 2-item spike on Aatrox. You're going to feel like one of the strongest units on the map, and you're not really going to get much stronger past that point, because most champions in the game are going to scale better than you past that, most mids and AD carry champs. Of course there are exceptions, but most of the time, this is when you're going to be wanting to do all of your work. At 2 items, carrying teamfights, carrying the game, making sure it's in your team's favor, or the other champs start to get a bit stronger. I'm not saying you fall off like really hard like a Renekton or something and become weak, it's just this is the time where you compared to every other champ in the game, you're going to be the strongest in the most situations. That's when you want to be getting most of your work done, but if you went Eclipse as your first item, that's fine. You can still pick up Sundered Sky second, or you can even go Shojin second if you want to be leaning more towards team fighting, but I would recommend going Sundered Sky as the item, especially in solo queue, really powerful. You can get away with a lot of it procs and team fights, and you can go more Mortius in games where they have a ton of magic damage threats. And as for your boots, most of the time it's going to be the top two. You're going to be going Merc Treads in games where they have a bunch of crowd control or magic damage, and played as Steel Caps in games where they have a bunch of physical damage, or you're side laning against a strong AD champion like Jax or Riven. It's going to be a great pickup. And you can go cooldown boots in games where you don't really need the other two, or you base on enough gold for it. And swiftness boots can be a good pickup against champions like Olaf or Nessus, where they have a lot of slows in their kit. Moving on to your third items, and I'm not going to be talking about the ones we already talked about, so we'll start with Steraks Gauge. And this is a filler item. You can be building it in games where you don't really need anything else. It's never going to be bad. It's just a decent item all around on Aatrox, and in games where you don't really need a resist like a Death Stance or a Kanik Rukin or a Moor, anything like that. This is going to be your standard pickup. Now you can go Kanik in games where they have a lot of artillery mages, like Xerath, champs like Zoe, Syndra, a lot of high magic damage, or even champions like Zyra support, where you're going to have to be running towards them. It's going to be really beneficial to have this really heavy magic resist item to keep yourself alive, especially in games where they have multiple AP threats. And you can go Death Stance in games where the reverse, if they have multiple AD threats, this can be a great pickup for you. And rounding off our build, we'll touch on the ones we didn't talk about. Spirit Visage is going to be built in games where you have extra healing on your team. So you have champions like Soraka, champions like Yuumi that are going to be giving you extra healing. This will be a great pickup. Or in games where you already built an MR item but you want to be stacking them. You want to be stacking multiple MR items. Maybe they have 4 AP damage champions. So this could be a great pickup as well, especially coupled with Sundered Sky. Or you can go Randuins in games where they have multiple crit champions. So if they have a Yone top with a Tristana AD carry, for example, or a Xayah, this could be a good pickup as well. Now I do have some full build examples down below, and I will also put on the screen, there is a Lethality Aatrox build running around right now, but as of right now, this is the best build, so I recommend just staying on this for now. Sundered Sky with Spirit Shojin, really powerful stuff, even Eclipse in certain situations is good, but of course a lot of people love playing that Lethality Aatrox style, especially after watching Zeus play at the Worlds, so of course there is a new Lethality build. I'd say it's not as good as Duskblade, it's just a bit of fun, so you can mess around with it if you want to. Next up we have Olaf, my boy, and on Olaf you're going to be building either Doran's Blade or Doran's Shield, but it will be Doran's Blade upwards of 90% of the time, because you only need Doran's Shield in really difficult range matchups such as Gwen or even Teemo. It can be quite good, but most of the time you definitely want to be going Doran's Blade and having a lot of strong all-in power early game. Now, out of all the builds we've covered so far, Olaf's is going to be the easiest. For your first buy, it's going to be played to Steel Caps if you can afford it, and you're versus an AD champion. This will be a great pickup, but it's very hard to get 1100 gold on your first recall on Olaf most of the time, so it's fine just to go multiple longswords. I do recommend staying away from Tiamat, because you don't want to be constantly pushing on this champion. You want to be looking to freeze, punish, look for solo kills, hit a Q, start fishing, pop ghost. You really want to be snowballing early game on this champion, not just shoving wave after wave into your opponent under tower. Some games it's okay, of course first tanks, but most of the time you just want to be building as many swords as you can and rushing your first item, which is going to be Ravenous Hydra. Now a lot of people have messed around with different items, but the problem with these new items, they removed a lot of haste from them, where on Olaf you need ability haste. In my opinion it's not mandatory, so Ravenous Hydra is the best rush, because it gives you a lot of haste, and it's still a powerful item on Olaf, even though they did remove the Omnivamp a couple years ago. Still a really strong pickup, and you can go Stridebreaker in games where you are up against ranged champions, so Kennen or Teemo, champs like that. It can feel quite good, but this item doesn't give haste, so as of right now, it is quite horrible. If they bring haste back to it, you could look to start this again, but for right now, you're going to be rushing Ravenous Hydra. Now, as for your second item, you're going to be wanting to go Experimental Hexblade. This item actually feels really good on Olaf. The reason you don't rush it is because, of course, it doesn't give ability haste, where you desperately need it. So once you have Ravenous Hydra coupled with this item, you feel really strong, which is why I recommend on Ravenous Hydra, you primarily play side lane, eat jungle camps, play for advantage, because team fighting at Ravenous Hydra can be quite difficult because you have no defensive stats at all. You're basically the squishiest champ in the game, really easy to kill, but once you have this 2-item spike, you get a bit of HP from this item, insane amounts of movement speed, so you're actually able to team fight. Now, there are alternatives, of course, especially if you went Stridebreaker first. You can still go Ravenous Hydra second in games where you want a side lane. The problem with going Stridebreaker into Experimental Hexblade, again, no ability haste. So if you go Stridebreaker, I strongly recommend having Ionian Boots as your boot choice, because you really need to have CDR at some point, and you can go Jackshow the Protein, you can go Ravenous into Jackshow, but I only recommend doing this in games where you're not very strong, where maybe you lost lane, you got behind, you still build your Ravenous, so you just want to have a bit of beef in team fights, you can go Juxtro the Protein, and Death Stance is going to be built in games where they have insane amounts of physical damage, and more in games where they have insane amounts of magic damage, and of course you just need to build an early resist to counter that. Moving on to the third item, and I won't touch on items we already talked about, so we'll start with the Aatrox, which is a really good filler item. You'll be building this in games where you don't really need another resist, really good item to pick up, especially now that you go Ravenous Hydra. You're not that tanky, even with the Experimental Hexblade second, so Aatrox is going to be a great pickup in games where you don't really need armor or MR specifically. Now, Frozen Heart is going to be great in games where they have multiple auto-attacking threats. So if they have a Graves or a Kindred jungle, this item is going to be amazing. Or if they have a Tristana mid, champs like that, or even a Zaya, it's actually really good against him, especially now they rush Ashes most of the time. This is going to be a good pickup for you. Now, for Death Dance, this is going to be in games where they have a lot of AD bursty champions, so Kha'Zix jungles, maybe they have Zeds or Talons mid. This will be a great pickup for you, and you can go Sundered Sky in games where you're going to be winning through side lane. If you feel like you can't really win team fights, maybe your team's holding you back, you've got some noob teammates, Sundered Sky is going to be good in games where you want to be purely winning 1v1 domination, or maybe even in games where you can win team fights, but you need to be matching side. Maybe they have a Yorick or a Fiora who are just doing so much work in side lane. This could be a great pickup for you to give you that extra bit of power, but most of the time, I wouldn't recommend this if you have the option to team fight, as it will make you quite squishy. And Kainic Rukun is going to be in games where they have a lot of magic damage in range, so champs like Xerath, champs like Syndra, Orianna, this can be a good pickup for you, and Randreds in games where they have multiple crit champions, so if you ever verse a Yone top, maybe you verse a Yasuo, or and they have an AD carry that builds crit down and bottom, maybe a Tristana, this can be a great pickup for you. And to round off the build, you can build Force of Nature in games where they have a consistent magic damage threat. Something like Cassiopeia, it can feel quite good. Now, I did talk about all these items, but I will talk about Juxtro again, because you want to have this item in every 6 item build on Olaf, I'd say, because most of the time you're going to have a resist of each kind, an MR and an armor item, and then Juxtro the Protein as your final item is going to make you really tanky, and it's one of the highest impact 6 items on a champion like this. And I've got a couple full build examples down below, feel free to take some inspiration from it. Of course, swap out the tabbies with cooldown boots in the Stridebreaker one, but a mistake on my part, but most of the time this is what your build is going to look like. You'll notice most of the time you're going to have Experimental Hexblade and Juxtro the Protein in your build. This is your core, this is your staple, and Ravenous Hydra is a great pickup to get you that early haste. Next up we have Rumble, and as for your starting item, you are going to be going Doran's Ring upwards of 90% of the time. This is going to be your staple starting item, but you can go Doran's Shield in matchups where they have a lot of range poke, so champions like Kennen or Jayce, it can be a good buy, but to be honest, you don't actually need it in those matchups if you have really high mastery on the champion, but it can be a good pickup, especially if you're learning just starting, or if you're a high elo player visiting really good range top players. Now for your first buy, you're going to head to the Nike store and pick up any type of boots you want. It really depends on the matchup. Now Sorcerer boots are going to be good in games where you're snowballing, maybe you solo killed your lane early, you can afford them and you don't really need that other resist. But of course you can go Merchants in games where you'd need it, so champions like Kennen in lane, it could be a good pickup. And Plated Steel Caps will be great versus champions like Riven, champions like Jax, it'll be an amazing pickup. So I definitely recommend it versus really strong all-in champions. But you can go Swiftness or Cooldown Boots, which is new. Cooldown Boots didn't used to be a choice on Rumble, but you'll notice Naguri, I'll put a little pop-up on the screen, he's been rushing them a lot lately, and that is purely because the price is so low. And of course, Swiftness, the boots are cheap as well, which is why you would buy them a lot last split. But of course, Cooldown Boots actually do give you a little bit more combat power than Swifties, depending on your matchup, so now you actually have that option. Now, Swifty boots are going to be great in games where spacing is very important. So if you're versus a range shot, where you don't really need the other 2 resist boots, or in games where they have slow, so champs like Nasus or Olaf, it'll be a really good pickup for you, but feel free to go for an early cooldown boots buy, because it's really hard to stay in lane till 1250 gold, you know, tier 2 boots refillable sometimes you just want to base early, around 900, and just pick up tier 2 boots, and the cooldown boots are going to be a great choice for that. Now, Haunting Guides is an option, very, very rare, but if you manage to get enough to buy it in one go, this can be a good pickup, your all-in power will be really high, but of course getting 1300 and enough change for pots, really difficult to do so, but if you can, feel free. And as for your first item, it feels good to finally have Liandry's back. You're going to be rushing this in games where you're up against a tank or a bruiser that stacks HP. So if you're up against an Aatrox or a Renekton, Liandry's will be great, or any tank, but if you're up against a really squishy champ, or specifically a range champ, so if you're up against a champ like Teemo or Jayce, champ like Vayne top, Protobell will be a good pickup for you because it's really cheap, really easy, and it's a good early spike to help you really get onto these range champs, stop them from kiting you. And Riftmaker is pretty rare. You can go Riftmaker in games where you're versus a really tanky team comp. So you can go Riftmaker into Leandries as your 2-item spike, and you're going to be really strong in that type of setting, because you're not going to be playing more so for one-shotting squishies, trying to cut them off of ulti. You're more so going to be cooking the beefcake, so if they have, let's say for example, they have Xin Zhao jungle, Dr. Mundo top, and maybe Cassante mid, that's overkill of course, but this will be a great pickup for you. So just in general, if they have 3 beefcakes on their team comp, this could be an option for you. Or even if they just have a really tanky top jungle, like Cassante Sejuani, you could go for this option. Or Banshees is pretty rare. I've only seen Naguri do it in matchups where they have a lot of AP threat from top and jungle. So if you're up against a Elise jungle with a Gwen top, or a Kennen, with a Nidalee, something like that, this can be a good pickup for you and basically allow you to 1v2 them. As for your second item, Storm Surge is going to be a great pickup. This is really going to help you, especially if you're snowballing, do a ton of damage and blow up squishy champs. This is going to be a good pickup for you in games where you're ahead, but in games where you're doing not so well, maybe you're 0-0, 0-2, or even in games where they have a ton of MR threat, you're going to be picking up a Crypt Bloom second. Getting that early magic pin feels really good on Rumble, and you can go Leandre second in games where you didn't buy it already, but you still need it. They still have some HP stackers or some tanks. You can build the second in games where you're in a different item first, or you can go Zhonya's in games where you need it, where they have champions such as Zed or Talon, strong AD divers, maybe they have a Jarvan comp. This can be a great pickup for you. Moving on to your third item. Now, Shadow Flame is a really powerful option on Rumble, but you can only really buy it in games where you're snowballing or they just have no MR. So this item is really powerful combined with Storm Surge, really good pairing, and you're going to spike really hard of 3 items, but it can be quite hard to buy. There are a lot of tanks in the game right now. Tank items are quite strong, so you will need to go Crypt Bloom most of the time. So keep that in mind. Only go Shadow Flame in games where they have very little MR or you're just snowballing so hard, you're going to be using it to just continue snowballing, do extra damage, and basically just one-shot people. Now, the alternatives, you can go Rabadon's Def Cap in some games where you don't really need any of the defensive items. You don't need a Banshees or a Zhonya's, and you've already got a Crypt Bloom as your second item. This can be a great pickup for you, but most of the time, it's going to be as a 4/5 item. It's just an option if you already have Magic Pen second, and Morello's is going to be built in games where they have a lot of healing. So Dr. Mundo's, Soraka's, champs like that, this can be a good pickup for you. He's one of the few top laners that's fine to build healing cup. And then as for your Void stuff, it's going to be rare that you pick this up over Crypt Bloom, but you're going to be building it in games where, let's say you base with the Blighted Jewel, and you have enough for both, so you have the option. Then you can pick up Void stuff in games where they have a ton of MR. A lot of tanks, so much MR stackers, some Kanig Rukins running around, Fed Cassante. This can be a good pickup for you. We need that little bit of extra magic pen, and you already have enough gold for it. As for your final items, we already talked about the reasoning for buying each one and when to do so. However, keep in mind, you do need to have Def Cap and a Magic Pen item, so Crypt Bloom or Void stuff in your build. By 6 items, you need Def Cap and Magic Pen item. That's not negotiable, you need to have this, so keep that in mind. There will be actually some games where you have to sell an item, where maybe you win a Protobout early, like Rockabout, later on to the game you can sell it for a Def Cap, because you don't want to be rounding out your 6 item build without one. Next up we have Fiora, and Fiora is actually really liking how this meta is shaping out. Ravenous Hydra feels quite good on her, but as for your starting item, you're going to be going Doran's Blade in most of your matchups, but you can go Doran's Shield in matchups where they're going to be poking you down. So champions such as Kennen, champs like Jayce or GP, Doran Shield's going to be a great pickup. You desperately will need that regen. And as for your first item, you're going to be going multiple longswords. Now you can go tier 2 boots in certain situations where they have a Riven top and Graves jungle, stuff like that. But most of the time, you're just going to be stacking swords. You don't really want to be building the Cauliflower Hammer or the Vamp Scepter or the Tiamat early. You just want to be stacking multiple swords. Some matchups, of course, those items will be fine, but most of the time it's just going to be Sword City. And as for your first item, you are going to be going Ravenous Hydra. Now, I do recommend staying away from the Tiamat really early onto the game, because you do want to be playing for individual advantage, freezing and punishing, but you can go Tiamat later on into the lane, around 8-9 minutes, playing for grubs. It's going to be great, especially in matchups where you're up against a tank. Sion or Ornn, you can just permanently push them under tower, maybe try to demolish if you can, proxy the wave. It's going to feel really good for you, and once you have the spike, which is why I don't recommend rushing tier 2s that much, because once you get their full Ravenous Hydra, the lane is just so easy. You just perma one-shot the wave, heal to full HP off the lifesteal, you can eat camps, and you basically become a farm vacuum. So you're going to be farming your way to your second item, which is going to be Triforce or the Eclipse. Now, Triforce is of course very standard on Fiora. The problem is the build path and it's so expensive, this item can feel quite hard to get. But if you're snowballing, you're quite fed, you're going to win the side lane anyway, this is a great pickup for you. Gives you a lot more damage to towers, but Eclipse is going to be great as a cheap pickup in games where you need some side lane power. So if you're fighting, let's say you lost lane to a Darius, or you're even against a Jax, a Gwen, champions that you want to be fighting them in the side lane as soon as possible, Eclipse is going to be a really good pickup for you. This item actually feels amazing on Fiora, but you will go Triforce most of the time, of course, because you are going to be split pushing primarily a lot of the game. This Eclipse is really good in games where you want to get that early pickup, that early spike, and have a lot of power in a side lane duel. And as for your boots, it's pretty standard. You're going to be going tabbies in games where they have physical damage champions, especially the one you're going to be fighting in side lane. Bergtreads when you need the tenacity, or their magic damage threats. Swiftness boots when you need the slow resist, so champs like Nasus or Olaf can be quite good. And cooldown boots are a good pickup as well. They're quite cheap, but keep in mind Ravenous Hydra and cooldown boots, really squishy combo, really squishy pairing of items, and you get a lot of haste from the Ravenous Hydra anyway. So don't tunnel on it as much as you would have last split, but it can be a good pickup, especially when you base with enough gold for it. And as for your third item, you have three choices. You're going to be going Death Stance in games where they have a lot of physical damage threats, where you're fighting one in side lane, and I do recommend this as the third item you get most of the time. This item feels quite good because your first two items make you very squishy, so this item gives you a bit of beef and a bit of survivability, and more does the same thing but up against magic damage. So maybe you're up against a Gwen or a Rumble in side lane, there's some other magic damage threats on their comp. This can be a good pickup as well, and Spear of Shojin where you don't really need their resist, or really in games where you're just purely winning through side lane. You don't really want to be team fighting, you feel like there's no win condition there, so you just want to be maximizing your side lane power. Now the other items you have for 4th and 5th is you can go Sundered Sky. Now again, this is going to be in games where I am only split pushing. This is my main win condition. There's just no way I can visualize a team fight, which is pretty rare because most of the time Fiora, around full build, 4 to 5 items, becomes quite powerful in team fights as well. So this is rare, but it can be a situation. Maybe they have a strong Enchanter comp, and maybe they have a good Xerath and a Cog Lulu support, and your bot lane's playing Callista Pike, something useless. So in that situation, you will have to win through side lane. Or you can go Rangers in games where they have multiple crit threats. So maybe you're up against a Yone top and they have a Xayah somewhere. This can be a good pickup for you. And GA is pretty rare. I'd only buy this in games where they have a ton of burst. So they're a wombo combo comp, maybe they have, a Moo, maybe they have Malphite Yasuo, stuff like that. Or they just have really strong assassins. Maybe they have a 20 kill Talon running around. This can be a good pickup, but very rare. And Aatrox is just going to be a good filler item. So when, let's say they have a 1 magic damage champion, let's say they have a Syndra who's playing quite poorly, maybe 0-4, he's got some bad items, you don't really need MR, and you've already got the Death Stance third, this can be a great pickup for you, and it's a bit stronger in spirit than Spear of Shojin in a teamfight situation, so this can be a good item for that situation, and Protein is going to be picked up in games where you already have an MR and an armor item, and you just want to be as beefy as possible in a late game teamfight. Next up we have Kennen, and on Kennen you're going to be starting Doran's Blade almost every single game. The only situation where I'd want you to start Cole is if you're in a free matchup, so a champion like Cho'Gath or maybe a champion like Sion, and you're really comfortable in the matchup, you feel like you can dodge skill shots, space them quite well, then you can go Cole. But most of the time you are going to be starting your Doran's Blade, and your first item is going to be, your first buy is going to be tier 2 boots. If you can get tier 2s on your first recall on Kennen, it's going to feel great. It can be hard to do if you're just learning the champion, so don't feel too stressed, but most of the time, if you can get tier 2 boots in one buy, it's going to feel really good for your lane. Now, soft boots are going to be the default, the standard if you don't really need a resist, which should be most of the time. Most of the time on Kennen, I'd recommend staying away from tabbies or merc treads, just because you're versus an AD or an AP champion lane doesn't mean you need them, but you can get them in games where maybe they have Graves jungle, Jax top, maybe they have triple AD topside. Then of course tabbies will be valuable, but most of the time you won't go tier 2s. The only reason I have them here is just because they're a boot. Tier 2 rush is really good on Kennen, and cooldown and swiftness are a good buy as well, because they're so cheap, they're so easy to get. If you can't afford sorcerers on your first buy, you can go these. Similar reasoning to Rumble, cooldown boots have popped up on Kennen now, just because they're so cheap and easy to buy. Now swiftness will only be in games where you need that slow resist, so champions like Olaf or champions like Nasus, it can be a good pickup, or even Singed, but most of the time, if you can't afford the Sorcerer boots, then cooldown boots are going to be your choice. Now, Hextech Alternator will be in games where you have enough gold for it. You don't really need the tier 2s as much, which is going to be very rare, but you can go this item in games where they're going to be forcing onto you. So for example, if you're up against a Camille, it's quite easy for her to get onto you, quite easy for her to land to you, and tier 2 boots aren't as valuable in that matchup, so pure stats from Hextech is going to be quite nice. Now as for your first item, you're going to be building Rockabelle most of the time. This item is so cheap and so good for Kennen, what he wants to be doing, but you can go Riftmaker with Conqueror in games where you're up against tanks that are going to be fighting you back. So for example, if you're up against a Cassante, it's actually better to go Conqueror and then Riftmaker and Liandry's as your 2 core, so you have enough power to actually get through them and do damage to them in side lane, so they actually have that opportunity to group up. That's not mandatory, especially in an elo bracket where you're versing bad Cassantes. You can always just go Rockabelle into Storm Surge and you're going to be fine. But I'm just saying, if you verse a good tank player that's playing champions like that, tanks are going to be fighting you back. Conqueror, Riftmaker, Liandry's is going to give you the actual power to fight back and all in them. Now, as for second items in general, you are going to be rushing Storm Surge as your second item. This is a really powerful item on Kennen, Proto Belt combined with Storm Surge, really good 2-item spike. You're really going to be blowing up the backline with this pairing, but you can go Crypt Bloom in games where they have a bunch of MR already. When they're starting to build Magic Resist, you will need that Magic Pin, this can be a good pickup. Or in games when you're not doing so well, maybe you're behind, going Shadow Flame and delaying your pin item for so long can be a bit risky. Not Shadow Flame, sorry, Storm Surge, always mix them up. But you can also go Zhonya's or Banshees in games where you need it. So if they have AD Assassins, Kha'Zix, Rengars, champs like that blowing you up, you'll definitely need to pick up a Zhonya's, or you can pick up a Banshees in games where they have AP variants of that. So if they have champs like Evelynn, that are making your life very difficult, then you can look to pick up this item. But I wouldn't just build it like, oh, there's Xerath's doing quite well, I'll get some MR. You don't really need it versus control mages that much, mainly so AP diving threats that are going to be making your life difficult. Now, as for your third item, you will be going Shadow Flame in games where you're snowballing or they just have no MR at all. Because this item combined with Storm Surge, really great pairing. But of course, if they're building MR or they have tanky champions in general, you will need to pick up a Crypt Bloom, get that Magic Pen going, and you can also go Void Staff as an alternative in games where they have a ton of MR, like ridiculous amounts of tankiness and Magic Resist. Then of course you will need that extra Magic Pen from Void, but most of the time Crypt Bloom is going to be your pickup. And I won't talk about the items we already touched on, so you guys know the best situation already for Zhonya's and Banshees, but the time you're going to be going Death Cap is basically any time on your 4th and 5th item, because all 6 item Kennen builds, you need to have Death Cap and a pin item. You need to have Void or Crypt Bloom and Death Cap by the time you get to 6 items, or you're going to be missing out on a ton of damage. Now you will need to go Morellos in some situations where they have ridiculous amounts of healing, maybe they have a Sona or a Soraka, some Dr. Mundo running around, but most of the time you do want to be trying to get your Death Cap by your second to last item or your last item if you absolutely have to. And down below I did put some full build examples and you will notice one of them is the AD Kennen variant. Now AD Kennen build has been running around and it is a lot stronger this season compared to last season because of the new items, but it's still AD Kennen. You're still completely horrible in team fights, but it is quite a fun build and really powerful in lane, so it is something you can mess around with, especially in games where you already have a bunch of magic damage on your team. Maybe you picked Kennen early on and your team's trolling you, picked a Karthus jungle or something, you can look to mess around with the AD Kennen build, and it is quite powerful for the 1v1, but you do have to just mainly side lane the entire game because your team fighting is going to be quite weak. Next up, we have Malphite, and on Malphite, your starting item is going to be Doran's Ring or Doran's Shield. Now, Doran's Ring is going to be great in matchups where you feel like you can poke down your opponent, specifically if you go the Comet or the First Strike page as well. This is going to be a good pairing, or you can go Doran's Shield in matchups where you're going to be taking Grasp and just trying to fight them down. So most tank matchups, you will go Doran's Shield and Grasp, and I talk about a lot in the Malphite guide, but generally just for items, Doran's Ring in matchups where you feel like your poke is going to be significant, and Doran's Shield in matchups where either you're very scared of their poke, where they have strong range champions, or you're just going to be fighting tanks to the death in a bit of a meatball battle. Now, as for your first buy, because Frozen Heart is so cheap, you want to be building this item as fast as you can in matchups where it's good. So if you're up against a champion like Jax, for example, or Jayce or Tryndamere, you want to be getting Water's Mail as your first recall if you can. Really hard to do so, but if you can do it, that's great. Most of the time you will just be sitting on 2 cloths, but this is really the goal. And then you can get Frozen Heart on your second recall, and you're going to be really hard spiked, around 1k gold cheaper than their spikes. You're going to have this really big timer where you're much stronger than them, and you can actually look to bully them around in lane. Now, you will be going Balmy Cinder in some matchups, where you're up against a tank, for example, champion like Cho'Gath or Maokai, and you're going to be rushing the Hollow Radiance, or a champion like Mordekaiser, where you need to do that as well. And you're going to be rushing that MR item, but you want to be going the Balmy Cinder early. You can go Negatron Cloak in games where they have AP top jungle, but most of the time the early Balmy is going to be a bit better, and then you're going to be going Merc Treads in games where you need the tenacity. So champions like Kennen, champions like Gragas, it can be a good early pickup, or you can go a Bramble Vest in games where you need that healing cut instantly, so pretty rare I'd say. Fiora is probably the only one where I'd delay Frozen Heart for a Bramble, but even then you don't have to if you're beating the Fiora in lane anyway. Maybe you think he's quite bad, it's actually better for you to rush that Frozen Heart as fast as you can. And as for your second item, you're going to be building either Sunfire Cape or Hollow Radiance. This pairs really well with Frozen Heart, because Frozen Heart doesn't give HP, so you do want an item that gives you that, and also the extra damage and wave clear from one of these Sunfire items feels quite good. Or you can go Kainic Rukin in games where you need that desperate burst of MR quite badly, so if they have champions like Xerath or Syndra, strong artillery mages, or maybe you're side laning against a champion like Gwen, it can be a good pickup as well. Really depends on how much magic damage they have, or how strong you are in the 1v1, it's going to depend from game to game. But if you're beating around the side lane Gwen, for example, or the Mordekaiser, and their magic damage isn't that high, Hollow Radiance is actually going to be a bit of a better pickup. Now, you can also go Protein in games where they have very little magic damage. Maybe they just have a 1 AP threat, maybe an Orianna mid, for example. This could be a good pickup for you as well. But you still want to have a bit of MR, because if you go, of course, Frozen Heart, Plated Steel Caps, and Sunfire Cape, literally no MR, you're going to be very squishy to that one guy, so Protein will be a good middle ground in that situation. But most of the time, you will be going one of the two Sunfire Cape items, or you can go Thornmail in games where they have a lot of healing. So mainly you're just up against a champion like Fiora, where you need that healing card quite early to beat her in side lane. And as for the third item, I won't talk about ones we already touched on. You can go Force of Nature very rarely. I'd say almost never, just in games where they have consistent magic damage threats. So champs like Cassiopeia can be a good pickup, but most of the time Koenig, Rukin, or Hollow Radiance is going to be a much better MR item for you. And Randuin's in games where they have multiple crit chance champions. So maybe you're up against a Yone top, this can be a good pickup for you as a third item, especially if they have another AD carry somewhere else in their comp. And Abyssal Mask is just going to be in games where either you're starved for gold, you're not doing so hot, and you need a bit of MR, or in games where your magic damage champion on your team is playing quite well. Maybe your Syndra is popping off, maybe your Akali is doing quite well. This could be a really good pickup for you. And finishing off the build, the most important thing to note is you need to have a Juxtra the Protein in your build at some point. This item is mandatory. This item is just really powerful, especially later on into the game. But other than that, you can just look to pick up the supporty tank items. So items like Knight's Vow or Trailblazer, really good on Malphite. Trailblazer is good in games where you have other dive threats, other dive bodies following you into battle. This can be a really good pickup for you. And Knight's Vow in games where your AD carry or your backline mage is playing quite well and you want to help keep them alive. Now down below I've got a couple full build examples, and I have put in the AP Malphite build if that's something you wanted to mess around with. Can be good in games where you want to be the main carry threat, maybe you're the only magic damage on your team. It can work, and First Strike into Malignus is going to be a really good pairing, and I see a lot of the one tricks go Nash's Tooth as a second item. Can be quite powerful, but in general I would say tank Malphite is the way to go. AP is just if you want to have a bit of fun, or in games where you're the only magic damage threat on your team. Up next we have Darius, and on Darius your starting item is going to be either Doran's Blade or Doran's Shield, depending on your matchup, but I do recommend going Doran's Shield most of the time. On Darius it's really important to get tier 2 boots on your first recall, and Doran's Blade can make that really tricky, because you get a lot less sustain than you do from Doran's Shield, so it can be harder to stay in lane for a longer period, but if you're really confident in your matchup, really confident on your Darius, then of course you can go Doran's Blade, especially in matchups where really easy to run them down. So maybe you're up against a champion like Poppy, for example, can be quite good, but most of the time I do recommend just going Doran's Shield for that extra sustain so that you can get a much better, stronger first recall, where your first recall is going to be the tier 2 boots. Heavies in games where there's an AD champion in lane, Merc Treads if there's AP champion lane, or if they have a ton of CC in their comp, and you don't really need that extra resist for top lane, but most of the time I would recommend just buying the boot that matches up against your lane opponent, because you want to be building it really early on. And you can go Swiftness in games where they have slowing abilities, so champions like Olaf, it can feel quite good, champions like Singe, champions like Nessus, it can be a good pickup, but most of the time I would recommend just going one of the two resist boots. Now as for your first item, you're going to be building Trinity Force most of the time, because even though the build path is quite weak, the item as a spike is massive on Darius, and of course once you have that, your side lane power is going to be quite strong. You are going to be weaker in teamfights than you would have been with Stridebreaker Darius in the past, where your side laning power is going to be stronger, so it's a bit of a trade-off, and the problem with the new Stridebreaker is just it feels so weak, no ability haste, no damage on the active, so the item is quite hard to build on Darius, and especially in lanes where you need to be fighting your opponent early. You need to have combat power in side lane, but if you're up against a ranged champ like a Teemo or a Kayle or something, Stridebreaker can be a great pickup, or you can actually go Titanic Hydra in games where you feel like it's going to be mainly team fighting. So if you're up against a tank top, for example, Titanic Hydra can be a good pickup, and it's really easy to get 5 stacks on this item. The problem lies is the combat power, the 1v1 fighting power, is not as good as Triforce, and also it doesn't give ability haste, so it doesn't feel that good in situations where you have to all-in people that can actually fight you back. But again, if you're up against a tank or you're just winning your matchup really hard, this can be a great pickup because it allows you to get 5 stacks quite easily, and you're going to have perma push in side lane. It's going to be very easy for you to rotate into fights. Now, as for your second item, you're going to be building Styrax Gauge in games where you go Triforce most of the time. This is the most standard choice, Triforce into Styrax, really good 2-item spike, but of course you can go more in games where you desperately need the MR. So if you're up against a Gwen inside that's giving you some trouble, or a really heavy AP comp, maybe AP top jungle, this can be a good buy. And in games where you need armor first, you can choose between Trailblazer or Deadmans or Randuins. The Randuins in games where they have multiple crit champs, especially if you verse one in lane, if you verse a Yone top, this can be a great pickup. But between Trailblazer and Deadmans, Basically, if you base for enough gold for Trailblazer but not Deadmans, that's basically a sign that you should pick it up and spike really hard at that timer, or in games where you have fellow dive buddies. The champions that want to be following you into battle, this can be a good pickup, but most of the time you're just going to be getting it because it's a lot cheaper and you're going to be basing with enough gold for it. But if you base with enough for Deadmans, of course you can pick that up, feel free. And Sundered Sky, pretty rare, but it's a game where you feel like there's just no way we're going to be winning team fights. I just want to have as much side lane power as possible. Then you can go Triforce into Sundered Sky, or even Stridebreaker into Sundered Sky. If you want a bit more side lane power, it can be a good pickup. But of course the trade-off is you are going to be weaker in a team fight setting. Moving on to your third item, and I'm not going to touch on the ones we already talked about, but as for Force of Nature, pretty rare, but you can pick it up in games where they have constant magic damage threats, so champions like Cassiopeia, it can be a good pickup, and you can go Kanik Rukin in games where they have artillery mages, so champions where you have to be running into their poke, champs like Xerath and Syndra can be quite hard, champs like Zyra, this can be a good pickup, even Brand Jungle running around right now, or you can go Thornmail in games where you need the healing cut, so especially if you're up against a champion like Fiora in the side lane, so you're going to be rushing Ravenous Hydra, ton of lifesteal, this can be a great pickup for you. And Frozen Heart, pretty rare, but if they have multiple auto-attacking threats, it's a good pairing because you already got a lot of HP from the Sterax from earlier, so this can be a good buy. So if they have a champion like Kindred Jungle, maybe they have Tristana mid, double ADC comp, maybe they have a Jax top, this can be a good pickup if they have a lot of auto-attacking champs, really cheap item of course, but you can go Spear of Shojin in games where you just feel like, alright, team fighting is just completely doomed, I just want a lot of side lane power, a lot of 1v1 power, or games where you just don't feel like you need a resist that badly, this can be a good pickup as well, especially if you are snowballing. And to round off the build, we talked about most of them, but Jaxo the Protein is good in games as a 4th and 5th item most of the time. Because by this point, you should have a couple resist items, you should have maybe a Kanik Rukin, your Randuins, maybe your Deadmans, you have an armor and an MR item from this point, so once you get a Jaxo on top of that, you're going to be really tanky and beefy in these teamfights. Up next we have Garen, and he's one of the champions that got hit the hardest by this new patch, specifically by Stridebreaker being terrible, but we'll go through it. And as for your starting item, you're going to be choosing between Doran Shield, Doran's Blade, but of course I do recommend Doran Shield. Garen is quite weak early game, so most of the time you will need shield in your matchup, but if you're in a free lane, maybe you're up against a Scion or something, or you just feel really confident in a specific matchup, maybe you've won the Aatrox matchup a few times now, you can go Doran's Blade and try to ego push against them. I'm just saying in most matchups it can be quite difficult, so Doran Shield is mainly going to be your default. Now, as for your first item, you can choose between Tier 2 boots or a Phage. Now, if you can afford Phage on your first recall, it's going to be a good pickup for you. Item actually feels quite good, and out of Triforce, it is the best component. Sheen feels horrible, Half-Bound X feels bad, Phage is the best out of the three, but if you can get the Berserker Greaves as your first buy, that is also going to be a good pickup for you still. Now, the reason I've got Phage here over Berserker Greaves, I'd say, is just because now that you're rushing Triforce over Stridebreaker, most of the time, Triforce, the faster you can get it, the better it's going to be. So if you're in a situation where you feel like you don't need the Berserker Greaves, if you can get away with it, if you can feel like you can be greedy, then just getting an early Phage and getting Triforce as soon as possible, going to give you a lot of power as a spike. Now, there are alternatives to Triforce. You can go Stridebreaker in games where you're up against ranged champs, so Teemo, champs like Kennen, Jayce, can be a great pickup. But of course the item is a lot weaker than it was in the past, so you will have to get used to that. And the reason I have Hullbreaker here with Grasp as a first item is because there is a Garen build running around right now where you actually just play pure split push rush Hullbreaker as your first item, and you will go defensive boots. Make sure you don't go Berserker Greaves with this build. You go Tabbies or Mercs depending on your matchup, and you basically just play to purely split push. So you go Hullbreaker into Triforce and even into Sundered Sky. So you're just playing purely to 1v on the side lane. However, I do think the most standard build is going to be Triforce into Stridebreaker second, and then you have the option to side lane and teamfight, so you're a lot more versatile, a lot more well-rounded, which ties me into the second item. Stridebreaker after Triforce feels a lot better because you're going to be getting actual ability haste from the Triforce. So now these items as a pairing will feel a lot better than just a standalone Stridebreaker would. And you can go Sterax also in games where you don't feel like you need the Stridebreaker. In games where you're fighting a bunch of melee champs, you don't really need that slow, doesn't really do much for you. Or in games where you took Conqueror, the Stridebreaker is not going to be as useful, so you can just go pure combat power from the Sterax, or Deadman's Plate in games where you want that extra mobility. You want to be just pushing inside and just grouping perma. Maybe you're in a game that's very scrappy, a lot of fighting, and you have some AD champs in lane. This can be a good pickup for you, or Mortal Reminder when you really need that heal cut and you want to be playing side lane. So if you're up against a Fiora, for example, this could be a great pickup for you. Or you feel like there's no way we can win team fights, but there's a tank in your way. Maybe you need that armor pin early on. This can be a great good buy as well. Now, as for your third item, you do have the option for Black Cleaver in games where you want to be team fighting, but they do have a bit of frontline for you to get through. They're quite tanky. This can be a good pickup for you because it also gives you a bit of HP. You're not full into damage like you would with Mortal Reminder, and maybe you don't need the healing cup. Black Cleaver can be a good item in that case, or Force of Nature in games where they have constant magic damage threats. So champions like Kog'Maw, consistent damage, champs like Cassiopeia, this can be a good pickup for you, but Kaenic Rukun is going to be more standard as an MR item, because it's going to be better in games where they have long range mages. So champs like Syndra, champs like Zyra that you have to run into, champs like Brand, this will be a good pickup for you. The shield is going to be quite valuable, and Kaenic and Sundered Sky is going to be great in games where you're just going to be side laning. This is mainly for the split pushing build. You want to be increasing your side lane power as much as possible. This is going to be a good pickup. And to round off the build, same items as before, the only difference is Juxo the Protein. You should look to have this item as your 4/4/5 item in games where you're still team fighting. If you feel like you can win a team fight, this is going to be a good last item for you. Otherwise, you just want to be building pure side laning items like Mortal Reminder or Black Cleaver, stuff like that, to increase your side lane power, or even the Sundered Sky. And I've got a couple examples down below, and you'll notice there's even a Ghost Blade in the side laning one. That's an option in games where you're just purely side laning, you don't want to be grouping at all, and you're snowballing quite well, but it is a snowballing item. You don't build it very often, which is why I don't have it here. Most of the time, you're going to be building the items I've got listed. Next on the list, we have Jayce. Jayce's build is pretty standard, pretty similar to before, but we'll go through it. For your starting item, you are going to be going Doran's Blade every single game. In the past, you would go Longsword refillable, but with the buff to Doran's Blade a few months back, it's just too powerful to give up right now, so you do want to be going that, especially now that Dirk is cheaper, a lot easier to get on your first buy. Now, if you cannot afford Dirk on your first recall, especially if you can't afford Dirk in pots, then you want to be going Tier Longsword, that is fine as well. Just make sure you're picking up an early refillable in most of your matchups, unless they're not doing anything, one of those players that just sits under tower hoping to get carried, then of course you don't need to. Most of the time you do want to be getting early pots on this champion, because if you're low HP, you're quite vulnerable, so you need all the sustain you can get. Now, if you can't get the Dirk, that's fine, just make sure you get Tear, but Dirk is a really powerful spike that you want to abuse, so if you can get to that point by your first recall, that's going to make you a lot more powerful in your laning phase. Now, for your first item, you are going to be going Ghostblade most of the time. I feel like Opportunity has been a bit of a bait, but the extra move speed you get from Ghostblade feels really good on top lane Jayce, because you want to be, it's still your job, basically, to deal with side lane. You're not going to just expect your control mage mid to deal with sides just because you pick Jayce. So you have to deal with side, get it pushed in, and then the extra movement speed from Ghostblade makes it really easy for you to rotate between the lanes, but also it helps you with disengaging as well if you get engaged on, so really good as a first item. But you can also go Eclipse in games where you're going to be jumped on, so if you're up against a Jax, Camille, Fiora, champs like Riven that are going to be fighting you, Eclipse is going to be a great pickup. Of course, it doesn't give lethality anymore, but it's still a really good buy, especially for extra survivability and these 1v1s versus champs that are going to be staunching you. Now, second item the same, always going to be Manamune no matter what. You need this item on this champion, and boots, cooldown boots most of the time. I'd say 90% of your game should be cooldown boots, especially the flash cooldown. Really nice to get from this item. But you can go tabbies in games where they have AD top jungle, or maybe you're up against an Aurelia top, really hard matchup. This can be a good boot choice against her, or Merc Treads in games where you desperately need the Merc Treads and the tenacity, and the magic resist. Moving on to Shroud's Grudge, which is going to be your third item most of the time. The only situation where you wouldn't buy this item is if you're snowballing out of control, or they just have no armor or tanks at all, then of course you won't need it, and in that situation, you can build Serpent's Fang in games where they have a lot of shielding, so if they have champs like Ivern, or they have champs like Lulu, this can be a great pickup, or you can go Hubris in games where you're snowballing. Now this item is overpowered right now, so of course you would build this in most games where you're snowballing, and you don't need the Grudge, but it is going to get nerfed soon. So if that's the case, you will just build it in games, like I said before, where they have no armor, no tanks, and you're snowballing, then it can be a good pickup. But if it gets nerfed too hard, Opportunity is a good substitute as well, just as a general lethality item if you don't need the Serpent's Fang. And more is going to be built in games where they have AP Assassins that is making your life difficult. So you wouldn't build a more versus a champ like Xerath, for example, because you can outrange most AP mids. Maybe not Xerath, that was a bad example, but if they have a Syndra or Ori, you can kind of outrange them. But you would build it in games where they have a champion like Fizz or a champion like Akali that's giving you some trouble. This can be a great pickup. And Sundered Sky is going to be built in games where you feel like side laning is your only clear win condition. You really need to have side lane power. It can make you a lot stronger, especially if you're up against a beefy bruiser, champ like Aatrox, champ like Olaf, Darius. This can actually be quite a nice pickup, coupled with Eclipse as well from earlier. It'll give you a lot of dueling power in the side. However, keep in mind, generally Jayce's best build in a best play in a team setting where you're poking down the opponents from far away, that type of thing. So you don't generally want to win through side lane, because even if you build this item, you will probably still get ganked and die from the jungler. But if you feel like this item will give you a significant chance at 1v2ing, creating a lot of pressure in the side lane, or that's just your main win condition, then go ahead. And to round off the build, same reasoning for all the items, the only new item is Guardian Angel. Now you can grab this in games where they have AD assassins making your life difficult, or a hard dive comp. If they have a Fed Talon or a Zed, champs like that, it can be good. Or if they just have a crazy amount of dive like Jarvan and Rakan, champs like that, where once their ulti's on cooldown, there's a lot higher chance where you can live, then GA can be a good pickup in that situation. And as for Edge of Night, pretty rare, but you're going to be building this in games where they have a key spell that you want to be blocking and no way to really pop it. If they have a Malphite, for example, or a Karthus, this can actually be a good pickup, but don't bother picking it up if they have an easy way to pop it. Maybe they have an Ashe that can just volley it off, champs like that. Just build it in games where it's really hard for them to pop it, and there's a key spell you want to be blocking. Next up, we have the big man Cassante, and your starting item is going to be Doran's Shield every single game. Very standard choice on him. And your first item, your first buy, is going to be a Sheen if you can afford it. Very good in a lot of matchups, gives you a lot of trading power, but you will need to go Bramble Vest in certain situations. If you're up against an AD auto attacker, that's going to be healing, so it can be good up against Fiora. I wouldn't really build against Aatrox, a lot of his damage is spell based. It's hard for him to proc it unless he intentionally hits you. So up against Fiora, champ like that, it can be good. But in general, you do want to be getting Iceborne Gauntlet as fast as possible. So if you can't afford Sheen, or you just want to have early armor, Chain Vest is a good pickup, but you can also go tier 2 boots in matchups where spacing and movement speed is more important, so primarily versus ranged champions. Say, for example, you're up against Kennen, Merctreds can be great, or up against a Gnar, or a Quinn, or a Vayne, Ninja Tabbies can be a good pickup. But in general, if you can rush Iceborne as fast as possible, that is going to be the strongest spike for you. And that ties us into our first item, where you're going to be building Iceborne every time you can. Every time you're up against an AD champion, this is going to be your rush. And you may have seen some pro players rush Frozen Heart and pro player, and that's really good in a pro game. But if you're playing a solo queue game, most of the time you do just want to be going Iceborne Gauntlet, especially if you're in a game that's not Challenger. Most of the time, Iceborne is going to give you a lot more value. Where you're going to have threat on your lane, threat in team fights. It's going to make you a lot more difficult to verse for your opponents, so it's a lot more strong as a solo queue item, I'd say. Now, the alternatives you have if you're up against an AP champion in lane, Renekton is actually really good versus AP champs that want to be fighting you. So up against a champ like Rumble, champ like Gwen, really good, but you go Hollow Radiance up against AP tanks. So champs like Malphite, champs like Gragas, this can be a good pickup. Actually, against Malphite, you could probably greed and go Iceborne with Merctreds, to be honest, but if you're up against an AP, basically another meatball, it's going to be hitting you, then Hollow Radiance will be good. But if you're up against an AP carry top, so champ like Vladimir, champion like Gwen or Rumble, then Renekton is going to be better. Now, as for your second item, you can go Juxtro the Protein in games where you don't really need that much MR, but you still want to have a little bit. So, for example, if they have a Corki mid, a Zoe mid, maybe they're 1-0, and the rest of their damage is AD, then this could be a great game for Protein. So you will still get a little bit of MR, but most of the stats is going to be towards HP and armor for you, which is going to help you a lot in your dueling for the top jungle, especially if they're AD champions. This item is going to be a bit better because you still get a little bit of MR, so you're not going to get completely one-shot by the AP threats. Now, if you don't need any MR at all, so for example, let's say they have a Graves jungle, or their AP champion is completely useless, Corki was a better example for this situation. Early game Corki doesn't do much damage, you can go Sunfire Cape in that situation. And it's going to help you a lot, especially in situations where you're fighting a bruiser on side lane. So if they have an Aatrox or a Jax, for example, that extra damage can help you out. But you can also go Thornmail in games where you need the healing cut as your second item, so mainly up against champs like Fiora. Or you can just go Iceborne second if you win an MR item as your first item. And as for the boot choice, we touched on the defensive boots, but you can go Swiftness in games where you need the slow resist. So up against champions like Singed or Olaf can be quite good. And you can go Ionian boots in games where you don't really need the Merctreds. Let's say they don't have much CC, and you already bought Iceborne, of course, you don't really need armor that badly. Maybe they don't have an auto-attacking based AD champions, then cooldown boots can be great, or just in games where you base for enough gold for it, and the other boots aren't that valuable. Now, as for your third item, I strongly recommend getting Juxtro the Protein at this point. This item is so powerful, and you really should be getting it around this point, especially if you have an armor item and an MR item in your inventory. This will be a great third item. But of course, if you need the other items, like we talked about Thornmail or Renekton in those situations, can be a great pickup. We can go Force of Nature in games where they have a lot of magic damage threats, or in games where you already bought the Renekton and you need a bit more MR. Maybe they have a full AP comp. And of course, Force of Nature will be great, or in games where they have consistent magic damage, so Cassiopeia, champs like Kog'Maw. But a lot of times on tanks, you are going to be tanky enough at 2 to 3 items, especially if you got Juxtro the Protein as your second item, so you can go more supportive choices. such as Locket or Trailblazer, if you want to be more supportive. If, say, for example, you feel tanky enough, the extra tank arm's not going to make a difference, but you want to be keeping your team alive, or maybe giving them the extra movement speed, this can be a great choice. So Trailblazer in games where your team wants to be diving with you, following you into battle, and Locket in games where you want to be blocking damage. Maybe they have a Kennen top, maybe they have a Karthus, this could be a great pickup for you. Or you could go Unending Despair, which is pretty rare, but you can build this in games where, let's say you went Protein second and their magic damage threat is still weak. You don't really need MR at this point. This can be a great pickup as well. Or you can go Hollow Radiance in games where you need a bit more MR and you want that extra damage from the Barmies. And for the final two items, we touched on all of them already, but you can go Randuins in games where they have crit chance champions. So if they have Yasuo's or Yone's running around, can be a great pickup. And I have a couple full build examples down below, so you can use that as inspiration, but most of the time your build is going to be good as long as you have Iceborne and Jaksha the Protein in it, so keep that in mind. Those are the two key items that you want to be having on K'Sante. And last but not least, we have Gwen. And on Gwen, the build is actually very similar. Your starting item is going to be Doran's Ring in most situations. Doran's Shield, of course, in matchups where you need it. So champions like Kennen or Rumble, where they have a lot of poke damage that you need to regen. And your first rush, your first buy, is going to be tier 2 boots if you can. Now, cooldown boots or Swifties are a lot cheaper, so you can build these. I would recommend cooldowns over Swifties unless you really need the slow resist. So if you're up against an Olaf or a Cinch, for example, that can be good. Most of the time it will be cooldown boots, but Ninja Tabbies are a really great first item rush, especially if you're up against AD champions, because if you blind pick Gwen especially, you're going to verse a lot of champions like Jax or Riven or Fiora. They're going to be trying to take you down, so playing the steel caps will be a great rush. Now, Merc Treads are going to be the same for AP champions. If you're up against Gragas or Kennen, or even a champion like Rumble, this can be a good rush as well. But against AP champions, I'd say it's not as important to get Merc Treads unless they have crowd control than it is to get played steel caps. Now, as for your first item, I strongly recommend going Riftmaker every game. I do see some people messing around with Nash's Toothbrush, but I personally am not a fan of this. Riftmaker is a lot stronger in my opinion. It is a lot stronger as a one-item spike. You actually get HP from this item, so you're not the squishiest champ in the game, where you would be if you rush Nash's. And although Nash's may be better in terms of pure side laning 1v1 in certain situations or hitting the tower, Riftmaker is better as an all-rounder item, so I recommend going this every time. And as for the alternative for a first buy, if you don't want to rush tier 2s or you base with enough gold for it, you can go the Haunting Guys and get your Riftmaker as fast as possible. Can be a good buy, but of course this item is very expensive, so it can be quite difficult to do so. Now, as for the second item, you are going to be getting Nash's Tooth every single game. As soon as you have Riftmaker and Nash's Tooth, you're one of the best champions in the game, so this is still a really powerful 2-item spike for this champion. Moving on to your third item, and Rabadon's Death Cap is still going to be the biggest in terms of pure damage. It is a powerhouse item, but there are going to be some situations where you need to buy something different. If you need Magic Pen, if they're building a lot of MR, maybe you're up against a tanky K'Sante, they built Kainic Rukin, then you can go for the Crypt Bloom instead. Or you can go Zhonya's or Banshees against where you need it. Now, these items feel a lot stronger than they did last season, so don't be afraid to build them. Zhonya's in games where they have AD assassins diving onto you, or a lot of AD damage. Champs are just diving into your face. So if they have champs like Talon or Zed, or even in games where they have a strong Vi Jax combo, stuff like that, Zhonya's can be a great pickup, and Banshees are going to be great in games where AP champs are diving onto you. So now that Akali top is back in meta, you might run into that matchup. Quite a good counter pick into Gwen, Akali, so Banshees will be a good item to mitigate a lot of her damage. Now, Morello's I would stay away from most of the time. Only build this in games where you absolutely have to, where they have a ridiculous amount of healing, but most of the time you really don't want to be building this item on Gwen, and you can also opt into Cosmic Drive in games where they're going to be trying to cut you out. They have a lot of range champions from far away, the movement speed is going to be quite nice, and the build path is a lot cheaper. You go Death Cap, you don't need to just build needlessly large rods, you can go the Fiendish Codex, a lot easier to buy than a Death Cap is, so this item can be a good alternative, especially if you base 2 items 900 gold. Pick up the Codex, a lot easier to build into this item than a Death Cap, but of course in terms of pure damage, Death Cap's going to be a bigger spike, because most of the time as you get through items, you'll be around level 15, level 16, so that's going to be your biggest time to carry the game. And to round off your build with the 4th and 5th items, the most important thing you need to know is make sure you have Death Cap and Crypt Bloom in your full build. I don't want to see you finish off your build with Morello's, Cosmic Drive, Banshees, and just don't have any room for your Death Cap or your Crypt Bloom. You really need to have both these items together by the time you get to your full build, because they're going to give you the most DPS in a level 18 late game situation. And down below I have some examples of full builds, but Gwen building is quite easy. Even if you copy that first build for item, it would be fine most of the time, but of course you'll miss out on the situations where you need to adapt. We need the Zhonyas or you need that Banshees early, the survivability. That's the biggest thing to notice on Gwen in terms of itemization, but most of the time if you follow that standard build, you're going to turn out just fine. Okay everyone, I'm going to finish up there, and I hope this video helped grow your understanding on what you're going to be building on these champions in Season 14, and keep in mind the main reason I wanted to make this video So you could combine this information with the information from those previous champion guides and still have all the information you need to know for how to learn and master those champions. So I hope this helped you guys out, and best of luck in Season 14, and I'll see you guys next time.